Our next topic will be social development. Erik Erikson was a student of Sigmund Freud and became very well known in his own right. Freud's theory stages are often termed psychosexual, whereas Erikson's stages are termed psychosocial. Do you know how many stages would be in Erikson's theory? 6? No, actually it would be 8. Now in this class, I'll only ask you to know a few. The first one and 1 or 2 that are most likely associated with your current age. But right now let's focus on the first stage. This would have the format of all future stages as well, a good possible outcome versus the bad. In the first year is a stage of trust versus mistrust. Depending on the parenting or caretaker's behaviors, the child will learn to trust the world, people, and them. For example, if when a child cries, they're typically comforted quickly, the child will learn trust. If they're hungry and they're fed quickly, they'll learn trust. If they're wet and if they're changed quickly, they'll learn trust. But if a child lays there hungry or crying from being needed for change, cries and cries, and sometimes gets their needs met, sometimes doesn't, sometimes promptly, maybe sometimes for a very extended time, that child will learn to mistrust the world, people, and in particular, their parents. Next, let's consider the very famous attachment studies performed by Harlow. Momentarily, you'll go to this clip, and as you watch it, record several things. Record the names for the 2 different types of mothers you see in the picture there. Describe its methodology in other words, how did he conduct the study, and what did he find? Did he find that attachment is due to feeding, or did he find that attachment is due to physical contact? So now if you could go ahead and access that particular video clip. So by now you should have put the methodology into your notes. If not, you might need to go back and review the clip. So what did he find? Which mother? It was the mother covered with the soft terry cloth. So in terms of is attachment due to feeding or to physical contact, clearly it is the physical contact. We've all heard the saying, a way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Apparently, Harlow would suggest there are other better ways. How could we measure attachment in humans? Obviously, we could not use Harlow's procedure to study the topic. Indeed, there is considerable debate as to the ethics of his study. The monkeys did suffer long-term damage. There was attempts to rehabilitate them through the use of younger monkeys to model more normal behavior, but still, they remained very mentally disturbed. But let's focus on humans right now. Momentarily, you should go to the clip attached and watch this particular study. You'll see Ainsworth's very famous study using the strange situation test. As you watch the videotape, just jot down the procedure, how she conducted the test. You can skip the categories and percentages. I'll give you slightly different numbers based on more modern research in the next slide. But again, do take notes on the procedures. You might well need this for your next test. So now that you've viewed the strange situation test, let's put the basic categories and percentages into our notes. More than half, that is 60% of infants, followed the secure style of attachment. 10 to 15% had the insecure ambivalent type. Ambivalent means mixed feelings. So intense distress, and yet did not seek, or if they sought, did not accept her comfort. Another insecure type was insecure avoidant. The child seems to be happy alone or with a stranger and does not need the reassurance when she returns. Another 10 or 15% of children didn't clearly fit any pattern. Now it's important to note that these styles of attachment aren't just for childhood. They carry into teen and adult years and are often the type of attachment that individual will display in their romantic relationships. So these attachment styles are lasting. Now let's consider perhaps the most famous of all developmental psychologists, Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist who focused on children's cognition. Take a moment and see if you remember the term cognition. If you said thinking, you are right. I might have told a story earlier in the course about Piaget, who was a child. His nanny came back to the family home all scuffed up and told the story of the thwarted kidnapping attempt, which never occurred, and yet Piaget has strong memories of it. Well, Piaget is the individual pictured above. Piaget is probably most well known for his concept of schema, sometimes called schemata, and his 4 stages. Unlike Erikson, whose stages I'm not asking you to know in their entirety, Piaget's stages, you will need to know both the order, the specific events that occur in each stage, and the name of those events. Let's start with the first stage, the sensory motor stage. As you can see, the time period is through the first 2 years. The child's intelligence, in the beginning especially so, is of a sensory motor nature. So they're not sitting around thinking about concepts. Their focus is much more immediate. Sensory, they have to learn how to use their senses. We said, for example, seeing, we have to learn to see. We have to learn to focus our lens. We have to learn to mentally flip the image. So they have to learn how to use all their senses, and they also have to learn how to use their bodies, how to roll over, how to sit up, how to stand, how to walk, and so on. So their focus of thinking is much more immediate, sensations and motions, at least in the early part of the sensory motor stage. Probably the biggest event acquired in the sensory motor stage is something called object permanence. Knowing that objects continue to exist even when they're outside of our presence. For example, if you own a car and you cannot see it at this moment, you are still quite certain that it exists. Now you hope it'll be in the same location and in the same condition, but nonetheless, you know it exists. For a child that's pre-object permanence, out of sight is literally out of mind. Go to the clip that you see attached below and look at some common tests of object, well, at least one test of object permanence. The one I chose is a very humorous one, and I hope you like it. And you can easily do this one with your own child or siblings or the child that you babysit. You don't need an IRB approval. When you looked at Piaget's stages and saw the 4 names, you probably noticed that 3 have the word operational. Operation is a term that we'll need to learn. So the term operation can be thought of as logical thinking. So let's consider this child of 2 to 6 or maybe 2 to 7. If they're pre-operational, can they think logically? Think a moment on this. In class, I get 2 very different answers. I get both a yes and a no. So decide, which do you think it is? Can that child think logically? If you said no, you're correct. What does pre mean? It means before, so literally it is before the stage of operations. This is the most interesting age to study in terms of thinking. Their thinking is not just less than ours, it is in a different fashion, which makes it very interesting to study. We're going to consider momentarily egocentrism, trouble with categories, and lack of conservation. Let's start with egocentrism. This term is used differently in informal conversation versus formally in psychology. So if you say, oh, she is so egocentric, or he is so egocentric, that is not how Piaget is using the term. The egocentric child of this age is not aware that other people have other perspectives, that other people view things differently. And that could be literal or figuratively. So for example, imagine a young child on the phone with grandma. Grandma inquires, did you get the present I sent for your birthday? And the child gives a great beaming smile and vigorously and happily nods his or her head. That is a prime example of egocentrism. Think of why that nodding of the head is egocentrism. Well, clearly grandma can't see the head nodding. The child is unaware that the grandmother literally has a different view. Let's consider two examples related to categories. If I ask you, are there more men or women in our class? You might say men, or you might say women. But if I asked you, are there more students or women or men in the class? You would definitely say there are more students. But pre-operational children will often tell you there are more boys in their class than there are students in their class, or there might be more girls in their class than there are students in the class, reflecting in part difficulties with categorization. Another one, perhaps you had this problem as a child, confusion when your mother calls her mother, mother. You wonder, why is your mother calling grandma mother? Or why is your mother calling her auntie, or your auntie, sister? Or why does your mother call your uncle brother? How can the mother be a sister at the same time? Again, problem with categories. Lastly, let's consider conservation. When you go to the link, you'll see various tests of conservation done on one particular child. Were you surprised at the answer he gave? Between 2 to about 6, the answer will be obviously wrong to an adult. At 6 or 7, they will have confusion. And somewhere between 7 and a tiny bit beyond that, they will give an adult-style answer. If you have children in your life, you might see where they are in this test. A sibling, a child that you babysit, a cousin. Have fun. Next, let's consider the third stage, the concrete operational stage. For the previous stage, I asked you, was the child capable of logical thinking? And we said no. If I ask you the same question on this stage, without looking at the slide next on the right-hand side, what would you say? Hopefully you would say yes, because it is a concrete operational stage. You see the word operational. But concrete modifies the word operational, so the child can, or the person can, think logically, but has distinct limitations. The items must be concrete, that's opposed to and in contrast to abstractions. You can see the child may enter the stage at 6 or 7. They may leave the stage at 11 or 12, but many individuals of normal intelligence never leave the stage. Students are often puzzled, who doesn't leave the stage? Well, in no small part, leaving the stage depends on having a formal education. Consider the illogical syllogism. I wanted to make up a name of people, so Waringi was the first made-up nonsense name that came to my mind. I'll have you help me with the blanks. All Waringi people love. What was the first thing that came into your mind? Think of something. Let's say tuna fish sandwiches. It's lunchtime now. All Waringi people love tuna fish sandwiches. Think of the name of the first man or woman that enters your mind. Rose came to my mind, so I'm going to say Rose. Rose is a Waringi. Does Rose love tuna fish sandwiches? Can we say decisively if Rose loves tuna fish sandwiches? A person that's in the concrete operational stage will say, well, I don't know Waringi and I don't know Rose. How could I possibly know? Well, you repeat. These are people who live far away. They're called Waringi people. They all love tuna fish sandwiches, and Rose is one of them. Does she love tuna fish sandwiches? And they will continue to protest. Don't you understand? And they'll probably start to think that you're of limited intelligence. Don't you understand? I don't know them. I don't know Rose. How could I possibly know? Well, they're limited. They're in the concrete stage. A person that's progressed to the next stage will say, well, if all have this characteristic and she is a member of this group, then since all these people have that characteristic, we can positively know that Rose must indeed also love tuna fish sandwiches. Let's consider Piaget's fourth stage. A convenient mnemonic is, if you say the word formal, you hear formal. So the formal stage is the fourth stage. So a person may get into it around age 12 or perhaps never. Again, it depends quite a bit on having a formal education, exposure to books, formal education. So many people that are intelligent who have never had that particular asset in life will never reach the formal operational stage. In this stage, the person is now capable of all types of advanced thought, including abstract thought. Let's now consider the brain of the adolescent and the young adult. We're going to consider a structure that we haven't mentioned up to this point, the limbic system. The word system implies a group of structures. Think of perhaps the solar system, a group of celestial structures. The limbic system, in part, contains our emotion center. In adolescence and young adulthood, the limbic system is complete, whereas the brain structure that regulates it, the brain structure for planning, for logical thought and purposeful thought, self-control, that is still work in progress. The result is often very intensely strong emotions because, again, the cerebral cortex cannot keep the limbic system in check. So in adolescence and young adulthood, irritation is more irritating, anxiety perhaps more anxious, love may be more intense. Another outcome is the risk-taking associated with this. Let's consider adolescent invulnerability. Adolescent invulnerability is the idea that the perspective that one is bulletproof, that one can engage in all sorts of behaviors and nothing bad will happen. And as I just noted, risk-taking is often the common result. Think of your peers, or perhaps even yourself. What are some risk behaviors that you might have taken in adolescence or young adulthood that maybe you would not consider at a later stage in life? Or if you're my age, you can look back at those years and look at your own behaviors and feel a little bit of surprise. This slide touches on a couple possible outcomes of this adolescent invulnerability. Maybe driving way too fast for one's driving skill set. And the outcome could be a sad picture such as the one shown on the right. Or perhaps it'd be sexual risk-taking, which could result in pregnancy or fatherhood, or STI, including HIV. Most cases of HIV are acquired in adolescence or the very, very early part of young adulthood. I can think back to my time period when I used to return from college. When I drove home, there was a very long and steep hill, several miles long, and I would often try to start at a certain speed at the top of the hill and see how far I could get down to the bottom without touching my brake. As a person my age now, I find this behavior just crazy, but definitely would reflect adolescent invulnerability. Next, let's consider a theory of moral development, one proposed by Kohlberg. It has 6 stages, and these stages are divided into 3 levels. First, we'll start at the pre-conventional stages of 1 and 2. We all began at stage 1. A person in stage 1, when they're deciding to do a decision or not to do a decision, the only focus is punishment. Will mommy punish me? Will my teacher punish me? So the only consideration is punishment. If that's the only thing that guides you in life is whether or not you'll be punished, that would be a pre-moral way of living. Another pre-conventional way of looking at moral development, and another pre-conventional stage, is stage 2. That focuses on self-benefit. The person is primarily overwhelmingly concerned with how that action benefits them. If it benefits them, they'll do it. If it does not benefit them, they will not do it. And that is their focus. Again, if that's the only thing that drives your decision-making in life, that would be a pre-moral stage, a pre-conventional stage of reasoning. We all began in the earliest stages of 1 and 2, and most of us have left these 2 stages. Though if you go down to the local jail or prison, you will find many people there that are in fact still in stage 1 or 2, probably no small part of why they're in that particular predicament. Let's go to stage 3, often termed the good boy and nice girl stage by Kohlberg. In this one, there's a couple different focuses of reasoning. One is the person perceives themselves as a good person and as a nice person and wants to be perceived as others as being good and nice. Also part of that reasoning of this stage is their heart. They listen to their heart. They listen to their emotions. So again, the two components for stage 3 are caring about how other people perceive you and listening to your heart. Stage 3 is a stage that many women peak at and stay at. This is not to say that men are not there too, but this is a particularly what men call feminine stage. Let's consider the next stage, law and duty. The person is particularly focused on following the law in meeting their duties and obligations. Many men tend to peak at this particular stage. Now, of course, there are women at this stage too, but there are more males than females at this particular stage. Stages 5 and 6 are by far the less common. Stage 5 is social contract. In this stage, the person considers the needs of society and the individual and considers both in their reasoning. Stage 6 is very rare. A small sample would have no stage 6 people at all. It's the stage of universal ethical principles. It's Bailey wandering into the room right now if you're wondering what the clicking is. So if you would do it for one person, the word universal would imply that you would do it for all people, for all situations. Let's look at how Kohlberg acquired his data. He created stories, scenarios. His most famous one was the Heinz dilemma. In this dilemma, Heinz is a man whose wife has cancer. Only one drug can save her. It's made locally, but the pharmacist wants a fortune for the drug, and Heinz is a poor man. He cannot come up with his money for the drug. There's only two choices. He steals the drug, and his wife has an excellent shot at living. He does not steal the drug, and she will die. And again, those are the only two choices. Kohlberg would then ask his subject, what should Heinz do? And more importantly, why do you say that? So let's go through all these stages and see what reasoning a person of each stage would propose. But first, put a little brief summary of the Heinz dilemma into your notes. So let's start with stage 1. Give an answer that would reflect punishment. It might jump out at you. The person would say, no, he could get caught. He could be sent to jail. Can you think of any reasons why Heinz should say that he should steal the drug? Now, if you're saying, oh, he loves his wife, no, that's not related to punishment. So you might say, well, just because he steals the drug doesn't mean he's going to get caught. Just because he gets caught doesn't mean that he'll get a sentence. The jury would be probably so sympathetic that even if caught, he would not be punished. So again, the answer is going to revolve and focus on punishment. Let's consider self-benefits. Give me some reasons why Heinz should steal the drug. Now, if you're saying to keep his wife alive, well, what is the benefit? Be more specific for me. He loves her? No, that's a different stage. So self-benefit, what does he get having the wife in his life? Okay, you might say that she cooks for him, then she cleans the dishes. What else? Maybe she takes care of the kids. She's a soccer mom. And I would say, well, what else? Maybe she works so he doesn't have to. She works a job and a half. And I would say, well, what else? What does she do in the wintertime? Shovels. What does she do in the fall? Somebody's got to rake. What does she do in the summer? Well, somebody's got to mow the lawn. So Heinz would do it because it was a distinct benefit. Well, how about the other side of the coin rather? What's the self-benefit in terms of not stealing the drug? Well, maybe she's showing wear and tear. Maybe there's life insurance and he can get himself a younger model, a trophy wife. Maybe he was getting displeased with her attitude and maybe he was planning to divorce her anyway. Well, in divorce, you have to pay half your assets. If she dies, well, all the assets are his to keep. Again, not very moral, but again, that's a pre-moral. That's the pre-conventional stage. Let's consider good boy, nice girl. Why should he steal the drug? This is the stage where you can say he loves her. Or what would the neighbors think if he was so cowardly that he let her die? But then again, maybe he shouldn't, because what would the neighbors think if he was put in handcuffs and taken away? Next, let's consider law and duty. You might say, well, he can't do it. It would be breaking the law. So even if there was no punishment, you shouldn't do it because it's breaking the law. Or maybe you can somehow construe this as part of your marital obligations. It might be your duty to keep your spouse happy and healthy and alive. Very few people would get to stage 5, the social contract stage. The person would think of both the needs of society and the individual. For example, maybe you'd say that she's a good woman, it would benefit her to stay alive, it would benefit Heinz, and because she's a good woman, society would benefit. Win-win, steal the drug. But conversely, you might say that even though she's a good woman, and it would be a shame to lose her, if we all broke laws and we felt justified, there would be mass suffering. So for the good of society, sadly, we should not steal it. Now, in terms of universal ethical principles, think of universal across people, across situations. So let me ask you a couple questions. If you had a child and your child needs one of your 2 kidneys, would you give it? If you can't say yes, please you don't have a child. But let's say it's not your child. Let's say it's your mother-in-law, who your partner is very fond of, but you distinctly are not. Will you still go through that painful surgery? Okay. If you said let's say that your neighbor needs it, and he is not Mr. Rogers. Let's say that he has a reputation and people are questioning the disappearance of local dogs and cats and attribute it to him. He's been seen to try to run them down. Let's say that he's trying to institute fracking on his property, which will poison all the local water supply. Let's say he's suing most of the neighbors. Think of the most heinous characteristics that you could put attached to a person and say that his neighbor fits all of them. He's a member of the KKK, neo-Nazi, everything that you find despicable. Would you give your kidney to your neighbor? Most of us would say, basically, hell no. But if you had a universal ethical principle set, you would say, he's a human being. If you do it for your neighbor, you would also do it for your child, and vice versa. So you can see that very, very few of us are at stage 6. I certainly am not. Well, we began this chapter with prenatal development. Let's now consider the other end of this. Let's consider death. See if you can answer any of these questions off the top of your head and from your reading of the book. Do you know the name for the study of death? That's a hard question. Do you know the name of the Swiss researcher? And it's not Piaget, but do you know the name of the Swiss researcher who gave us the 5 stages of grief or death and dying? Can you name any of them? Can you even put some of them in order? Now that you consider those questions, please go to this particular clip and view it. I think you'll find it very funny. As you can see, the study of death is thanatology, from the root thantos, meaning death. The most famous thanatologist by far would be Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Most people associate her with the 5 stages of grief or death and dying, but I also associate her with hospice. She was a Swiss country doctor, and many of her patients got to the end of their life, and she could do little medically, but she was there for them and still stood by them. And she found that many of them went through the same procedures of grieving for themselves, grieving their loss of life. But her patients died in their own homes, in their own beds, surrounded by their pictures, their view of the countryside or the city, their family, their possessions, maybe their pets, their friends. She was shocked and very saddened when she came to our country and saw that most people were dying in hospitals. So she came here and told us about hospice. She returned and returned and returned. Her lectures were originally small, and by the end would fill very large auditoriums. So hospice is something that's available to everybody in this country, no matter what economic status. In this point in the course, I would often ask people if they had any direct experience, and people would sometimes share that they have a family member that works in hospice, or they might share the loss of perhaps a grandparent. So hospices do differ. Sometimes the person goes to the hospice. Often the hospice workers will come to the home. So hospice workers are medically trained. There are many medical needs at the end of life, including pain control, but also to guide the person in the process, to answer questions, to make dying as stress-free and pain-free as possible, and the services provided to them and to their member of their families as well. So definitely associated with hospice with the gift that Kubler-Ross gave us. When you watch the video of the draft, did you record the 5 stages in correct order? If not, please go back and do so. You will need to know them.